All right, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for an Awake Security webinar titled Understand Your Attack Surface, What Organizations Can Learn from Election Security Challenges. Clearly, the United States is in the midst of an election season that is like no other. And while a lot of us may not want to hear about politics for a little bit, there are a lot of lessons we can learn from the election security challenges. Specifically at Awake, we approach the threat model from the perspective of an attacker looking to cause disruption. As we documented our results in a recent report, we realized that our findings were very relevant to organizations of all sizes that had nothing to do with elections. So in today's webinar, rest assured, we will have very little politics and instead focus on helping you understand your attack surface. We are joined today by Param Singh, who heads up the Awake Threat Research team. Param is a security innovator and thought leader with over 20 years of experience, ranging from threat hunting, threat intelligence, intrusion detection, big data analytics, endpoint detection, and red teaming. He's played key leadership roles, including building the SOC, threat hunting and threat research practices and the development programs at organizations like SecureWorks, Carbon Black, and now at Awake Security, which is a division of ARISTA. If you have questions or technical difficulties, please use the Q&A and chat features in Zoom. But in the meantime, Param, over to you.
Thanks, Rudolph. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar. As Rudolph mentioned, like in this webinar, we will try to understand how to evaluate your attack surface from outside in. And for this example, we chose the election cycle. Before the election date, there were many security concerns around disinformation, security of the ballot itself, and most importantly, what happens after November 4th. Many of us in the information security domain asked ourselves, could a threat actor contribute to the chaos by disrupting the infrastructure and actually comes to the fore post-election day? And as we have seen this kind of activity before, for example, NotPetya was a very highly destructive attack used against Ukraine by attackers believed to be linked to Russian military. We have also seen similar attempts to change computer vote totals and declare fake winners in past elections across the globe. So when we were thinking about how to evaluate the election security, we put ourselves into attacker mindset. As many of you already know about cyber kill chain, uh, uh, in order to understand what steps an adversary may complete to achieve these objectives, we started our analysis from the Lockheed Martin famous cyber kill chain. This cyber kill chain is broken into 7 steps, as you can see on the screen, which an adversary need to complete. Focusing on each step, an analyst can enrich their understanding of adversaries' TTPs, which are like techniques, tactics, and procedures. To take an example, a very common attack may start with, if we go from like 1 to 7 over here, a very common attack may start with adversary conducting reconnaissance to gather email addresses for an organization. In this modern day, you can get email addresses, which positions and other things from social media like LinkedIn. So if you have like a paid LinkedIn account, you can download all the email addresses, and you also know like who is CFO, who is CEO, and what is the relationship. An attacker then can take all this information and weaponize by creating targeted spear phishing email, which is then delivered via email. And opening the attached document, it may exploit the victim's machine and install malicious code for persistence. Upon success, attacker code reaches back to command and control server and starts to exfiltrate information. So that completes the kill chain. There are many great presentations that discuss different use cases of cyber kill chain. So I will leave that as an exercise for the audience to review. But coming back to the election related research project, we solely focused on the first 2 parts of the kill chain, which were reconnaissance and weaponization. Obviously, our goal was not disruption, but just to evaluate that what will be the first few steps that an adversary will take to disrupt an election cycle. So many of you may also be aware of the MITRE attack, but recently MITRE also released a pre-attack section to their enterprise matrix, which provides some details on these techniques, which we will be discussing today, especially reconnaissance, weaponization, and delivery. For reconnaissance, MITRE ATT&ck, as you can see on the table, in the table over here, for reconnaissance, MITRE ATT&ck talks about active scanning to identify hosts, networks, services, which are commonly seen in organizations. This can be broadened up by scanning victims' website, uh, job boards. Job boards are my favorite because it gives a lot of information what you may be running in the backend and which languages and which other systems you may be in the play. So a lot of information can be gathered from job boards. LinkedIn posts are another good example. And I have even seen like people posting configurations on Pastebin. So an attacker may do the same thing and they will monitor Pastebin for certain keywords. And if they see anything, they can exfiltrate, like they can collect data from there as well. So reconnaissance plays an important part in this cycle. Next comes weaponization. This could range from finding existing compromised accounts being sold in dark web uh, to finding exploits for services which were found during the reconnaissance phase. Followed by delivery, which could be simple spray and pray phishing campaign to complicated exploitation of trust-based relationship. So MITRE pre-attack framework goes over all these techniques in much more depth. And again, I encourage listeners to go over them as tabletop exercises in their organization. So we began our research by analyzing ASN information. ASN, or Autonomous System Number, is the backbone of internet routing. ASN table, which is freely downloadable, contains entries with unique ASN ID, IP address ranges, and organization's name, especially big organizations. Uh, so for example, in this screenshot over here, as you can see, we are trying to analyze this data using Jupyter Notebook, which is a great way for doing big data analysis, which we will be doing. So basically, like in this highlighted section, you can see that the first entry is from Cloudflare, which provides the start IP and the end IP in the integer format, along with the country code and the unique ASN ID. In the ASN table, there were like 500,000 rows with all the organizations and their start IP and end IP ranges. But for the research that we were doing, we wanted to focus on state and county offices. As most people know, even federal elections, like for the President of the United States, those are run at like local, county, and state level. So to focus on the SLTT, which is like the state and local county offices, we filtered the ASN information data set and narrowed it down to 178 unique ASN IDs, as you can see on the screen over here. So basically like a lot of like regular expressions and filtering to distill down from 500,000 to 178 rows. Once we evaluated these 178 rows, we found that like there were 6.4 million individual IP addresses which were in these in this ASN start and end IP address ranges. This gave us like the broad attack surface that we needed to analyze for this research. Obviously, not all 6.4 million IP addresses will be connected and live to the internet. So we use like a third-party service, and there are plenty of them, which continuously scan the internet, and they maintain a database of like ongoing inventory of like internet connected systems and services hosted on those devices. Shodan is one of the most popular one, but there are plenty of them available. So when we use some of these services, we found that out of like 6.4 million IP addresses, 40,000 were connected to the internet. So that narrowed down our data set from 6.4 million to 40,000 devices. Next, we were able to use geolocation information. Again, this is like freely available. We were able to use geolocation information, latitude, longitude of all these internet connected devices, and plotted them on a map, which is shown over here. Some counterintuitive aspects quickly jumped out when we looked at this map. I was not expecting Minnesota or North Dakota to be on the top of the list with 5,000 devices connected. Even though they didn't have like the big presence in the ASN numbers, their ASN numbers were much smaller, but the number of devices that were connected to the internet were fairly high. On the other hand, two states, Indiana and West Virginia, had zero internet connected service devices, which was again surprising. But a quick analysis showed that they do have internet connected devices, but they are non-attributable in the sense like they are connected using an uplink from AT&T or cloud hosted, which is very common these days. So for our research, we focused on the 40,000 devices that we collected through ASN information and not try to do like a complete research on like the AT&T or some other uplink provider that they are using. So once we got our list of live hosts, we started to dig further. We started to look into what open port information we can collect and what services might be running behind them. As you can see on the screen, based on the IP addresses and ports, we identified a total of 76,000 services exposed to the internet uh, across these 40,000 devices. As expected, and seen in this graph, traditional web ports, which are like ATN 443, were the most common. And they were found on like around 22,000 devices. These would be typically your web servers running Microsoft IS, which will be running applications such as like WordPress over them. These web application could be custom built or could be off the shelf like WordPress. And they will definitely have their own set of vulnerabilities. But for the purpose of this analysis, we did not attempt to uncover them. We kept our focus on the network infrastructure. So we have the ASN information. From there, we got the host and the port numbers. And then like we saw that like 50% of them are web servers. So the next step was like, can we identify which particular web server they are running? And as you can see in the screenshot over here, many default web services expose their application name and the version information. Those are exposed just by like a simple connection. So again, we did not do any of these. These were all provided by third party that we used. They are continuously scanning the internet and they provide this as a service. But this is an example where I reached out to Apache.org. You can see that they are running obviously Apache and 2.4.18 and on an Ubuntu machine. So like all that information we can collect from a simple HTTP banner, and we can start building a database out of this. So the goal over here was to understand what type of services are running. And when we evaluated this, we found that the usual suspects, we found Microsoft IS, Apache, Nginx, Light HTTPD. But when we dug further into the versions of these services, things began to get really interesting and scary at the same time. On the right-hand side, the bubble chart that you see, those are the web servers software running on all the SLTT, all the 22,000 machines, which I mentioned before. And some of these services were released in year 2000. So if you see on the right-hand side, there is like Microsoft IS 5.1, Microsoft IS 6.0. Those have already EOL'd, and those are like probably like 2 decades old by this time. Many of these systems are not even supported by software maker and consequently have no security patches or updates. From an election context, any of these web servers which are running with the domain name and IP address of a trusted county and state government could be compromised and used to spread disinformation about who won the election. This is a technique which we have seen before, and this got obviously, as you can see, this got us like very concerned about what could have happened. So that's the story of the HTTP and HTTPS. We also wanted to look at like, apart from, if we take the top 2 ports and look at the remaining 50% of the services, what do we see? And while web server and legacy application running on them are good targets, we also wanted to understand other services exposed in these environments. After excluding HTTP and HTTPS applications, we found email servers that, if exploited, could be used to steal emails and send fake messages from official accounts. We found a lot of like remote access services like RDP, SSH, PC Sync, and unfortunately, Telnet, in 2020, Imagine that. We also found like Telnet that provides access to state and local infrastructure over the internet. These are great attack targets for establishing foothold for attackers to compromise the infrastructure and spread laterally. Very shockingly, we also saw like some of the internal only ports, things that we never think that like they will be connected to the internet. For example, SMB and Kerberos. And if you know, like recently there was zero logon vulnerability that came out for Kerberos. So that was like pretty shocking as well. So as an attacker, if I look at this tree chart, what things pops up at me is that we have SSH ports. Probably those are like management ports. And if those are like just like management ports, I will like if I was an attacker, I will try the default vendor passwords or dictionary attacks. Next is MSRDP. Again, remote access. Let's try dictionary attacks. FTP port could allow anonymous file uploads, and they can be very dangerous if FTP service is enabled on the same server where web application is running, because then you can upload a PHP file and then call that PHP file through the web application and get access, get like those. That's like a typical how web shells are installed. Then we can also see SMB ports. As I said, like those are internal ports, but they are connected. And there are like many, many, many vulnerabilities which have been released around SMB protocol. And last but not the least, even Kerberos, I was like kind of like astonished that like Kerberos port is also connected, especially after given the recent zero logon vulnerability, which zero logon, if you're not aware, it's like a high risk vulnerability against Kerberos, which gets direct admin access to the machine without any authentication. Clearly, all of these significantly increase risk to these organizations. So next thing which we did, as you can probably tell from my voice, that like we were concerned about Kerberos, and we found like almost 500 devices with Kerberos port open and connected to the internet. And so we used the geolocation data as we showed before, just to quickly see like which states are more susceptible to this kind of exploitation. Um, and like while we cannot, because like we are doing everything passively, we cannot verify that all these cover reports, whether they have been patched or not. We can do that if we run some scan and do active scanning, but passively we couldn't tell. But this brings like an interesting point, that there is a time window. Like if there is an attacker who scans and collects all this information, puts in a database, then there is a time window between vulnerability disclosed and the time to patch. And between that window, if that window is like a few hours, that is enough for an attacker to get into these environments, move laterally, and then even if you patch your system, it is not going to make any difference because they have already moved on to other internal systems. So those like the vulnerability disclosed to time to patch, those are like kind of the metrics that like we typically recommend organizations to keep track of. Moving on. The next thing, obviously, with the coronavirus that we wanted to understand was the remote network access. We do understand that like some of these SLTT environments, like state and local county offices, they were not probably prepared for work remotely environment. And they may have overexposed or increased the attack surface when they were preparing for COVID-19 and preparing people to work remotely. So with the remote workforce, we saw an increase in popularity of remote access tools and VPNs across the board, not only to SLTT, but like across all our customers. We found like in our research, we found like 766 devices that were running RDP in the data set. This figure shows the states with the highest density of RDP services that were accessible from the internet. Uh, I'm sure like many of you know that RDP is the number one attack vector used by ransomware gangs for the initial compromise. We see it all the time in our IR engagements that it's the first patient zero where like the attacker gets into the environment and then moves laterally. Last year there was like a vulnerability that came out called like Bluekeep, which was also targeting RDP. And again, like if these RDP servers they don't have like multi-factor authentication and other things. They could be targeted by like dictionary attacks and other things. And in the dark web, we always see people selling and buying credentials to RDP access, because that's like a great way to get foothold into any organization. Uh, like as I was saying, like on the dark web, we also see compromised VPN accounts. We saw like an uptick in compromised VPN accounts being sold and bought. And in our analysis over here, we found like 5,000 VPN devices or concentrators like connected to the internet. And they were like from different vendors like Citrix, F5, Palo Alto, Mobile Iron, and so on. And in the last 12 months, we have seen more and more adversaries attacking these VPN concentrators to get into the environment. If you look at the number of vulnerabilities released before 2020 and after 2020, just for the VPN, you will see like a huge uptick. So adversaries are also like learning about the new environment, the changing remote workforce, and they are changing their tactics also. So earlier this year, when COVID-19 happened, I think like in March, April timeframe, we conducted a separate research on shadow IT. So shadow IT is basically like your IT team or your CISOs. They say that like use one system, but people use other systems to get the job done, basically. And that we saw like a rise in the shadow IT with the overnight shift to remote work. Our goal in this particular research was to check that like if there is unauthorized network changes, uh, unauthorized applications which were installed, or services that were enabled. And we found like a 65% increase in file sharing services, with most environment using 5 different services when only 1 or 2 were approved by the org's IT team. So in most of the organization, they're either using Office 365, Google Suite, and other things. But if you're using 10, 15, there's no control over like where your information may be leaking. So that was the purpose of our research, just to go in our like customers' environment and see like how the dynamics are changing. Network is always changing, so it's always interesting to review that. We also saw like a huge usage and remote access too. In fact, it jumped up by like 75% after remote work. We saw tremendous increase in TeamViewer, RDP, and other tools which are used by administrators, but they are also used by attackers also. TeamViewer is one of the very prominent tools that we see attackers installing. And let's say if you're an attacker, you get into a system or into an organization, you want to use the same tools that they're using so that you're not blip on on the radar, right? So that's what like these attackers do. They get into the system, they see like what you are already using, and they will just leverage that only. So in most organizations, we saw a huge uptick, and with the decreased control, there's an increased risk. And needless to say that these unauthorized tools increase the organization's attack surface and risk. So coming back to our research, we started with the ASN. We went to we filtered to the networks that we wanted to understand the attack surface. We found the IP address, port number, and services information from the third party that we used. So we started digging further into how an adversary will move into the next step, which is the weaponization. So I know like the attack surface, I know the services for a given organization. So what to do next? How do I figure out like what attacks I should be using? So many of you are already probably aware about like the CVE database, which provides a reference method for security vulnerabilities and exposures. So this is a screenshot of like a typical, I think this is zero logon. So this is a typical CVE page that you may see. And one thing that some people miss out is that like along with the CVE, they also provide the CPE information. So NIST provides CPE database, which is a standardized method of cataloging applications, operating system, and devices. So it becomes like a good way to join 2 data sets. As we see in the screenshot here, you can see each CVE number is associated with one or many CPEs, depending upon different applications and versions that may be impacted. So on the right-hand side, like this is zero logon, but on the right-hand side, you can see it is impacting Microsoft as well as Fedora. The CPE information is the same as we saw in the HTTP response from Apache server before. So if you remember, like a few slides back, I was showing that like I reached out to apache.org. They said like this is running Apache on Ubuntu and some version number. So taking all that information, I can populate a CPE, and then I can use that information to join the scanning information to the CVE information. So that was the goal over here. So once we built additional column of CPE information in the previously seen scanner data set, we were quickly able to correlate those 76,000 services to relevant vulnerabilities. One other thing that like people sometimes miss out on is the CVE dataset also provides CVSS scoring system. So on this screen, you see the 9.3 high, that's the CVSS scoring. So the CVSS scoring is based on multiple, uh, so the CVS scoring is like a vector-based scoring, which can be expanded to provide details such as what is the attack vector, what is the complexity. So as an attacker, if as an attacker, when you look at this data, you want to use something which is network-based and the complexity is low. So so you can think of this as like a big Excel sheet, and you can say that like, okay, show me the attacks which I can conduct from network and the complexity is low. Those are your lowest hanging fruit, because you don't have to be on the machine itself. You can do it from the network, and the complexity low means that like there's already a Metasploit plugin, or there's already some GitHub repository with the attack code. So again, what we were trying to do was we have the services information of all these 76,000 services which were exposed, combine it with CVE using CPE data, the platform enumeration data, and then come over here and see like, okay, what can we do? So again, start with ASN, find the IP address and the port number. From there, find the services. From the services, find the CVE and the CPE information. That goes back to CVSS scores. And from CVSS score, we can think about what exploits and what delivery we can use. So that's like a pretty automated way of going from recon to weaponization. And as soon as we connected all the dots, we generated a graph to see that like, okay, what's the exposure? So this figure shows the result of CVE and CVSS correlation with the 76,000 services that we discovered across all these state and county offices. The figure shows distribution of vulnerabilities by year. So those are like CVE year numbers at the bottom. And the number of IP addresses that were impacted by that. It is concerning to see that vulnerabilities go back to the early 2000s, as I was saying, showing that like Microsoft IS 5.1 and other things. So obviously some of those go back to 2000, and large number of devices with exposure to vulnerabilities from a decade ago. More recently, we see exposure to infamous vulnerabilities such as SMB Ghost, Bluekeep, Heartbleed. All of those vulnerabilities have their own name, have their own website. So those are like, and plenty of exploit code available to try out. A skilled attacker may also daisy chain these vulnerabilities. So basically like combine 5 low vulnerabilities into one high risk vulnerability. So that can be also done. And you can connect different vulnerabilities with lower CVSS score to compromise the device and move laterally. So that is also possible. So we took all the high vulnerabilities, like vulnerabilities where exploit code is easily available. The vulnerability can be exploited over the network, the lowest hanging fruit, so as to speak. And again, we put it on a map. And we again see every state with exposed devices and services which can be easily exploited. In other words, every state where we found internet connected devices also had a high risk vulnerability for which an exploit is readily available, freely available. So again, how does this relate to my organization? I think that question came from Rudolph when we were like preparing for this presentation. Okay, how does this matter to me? And we talked about like SLTT doing their attack surface analysis. And some of you may feel that like you have all these things sorted out. However, remember that all networks are dynamic and ever changing. We saw that in 2020 among many things have shown us that like networks are ever changing and it's so dynamic, especially with the remote workforce. Cyber security is compared to asymmetrical warfare because while we need to protect everything, an adversary just has to find one misconfigured firewall, out of date software, weak password, weak access control. Uh, so, uh, so here are some of the questions I would encourage you to ask yourself or your team when you think about like how this impacts to me. What are the steps that you are taking to protect against recon? Do you perform continuous external scanning? Do you have a change management that like every time you expose anything or make a firewall change, you again do the external scanning? How do you reduce your attack surface? How do you handle your shadow IT issues? Do you review information leak via like employee post on like LinkedIn, Pastebin, or even Stack Overflow? Sometimes people post their code snippets and other things on Stack Overflow with a lot of information. And how do you protect against weaponization? Have you implemented MFA on all external services? Have you enabled zero trust networks? How do you handle patch management? Remember, we were talking about the time window between vulnerability disclosed and between you patch. That is very important. Everything is like up to date today, but tomorrow it can change with the vulnerabilities disclosure, and anything which is in your DMC and accessible from outside needs to be fully patched. Otherwise, like 1 hour is enough to attack the machine and move laterally depending upon what type of vulnerability was disclosed. And do you review compromised accounts? Do you monitor dark web to see like what accounts from your organization, whether any VPN accounts or any RDP accounts from your organization is being shared in those channels? So we come back to from where we started. So we conclude this presentation again with like cyber kill chain and because I think like again this is like a good way to visualize and think about what we are doing in our organization. Working with many organizations, I see that majority of their effort goes into monitoring and looking for that phishing email getting delivered, doing intensive EDR reviews for exploitation and installation. So that's where like most of the focus goes. Then it is followed by time and budget going into responding. The IR team responding to successful attacks through incident and breach response. And then finally, the remaining time, which some companies have, some companies don't have, goes into assessment of attack surface, identifying weaknesses, and layering defenses. Our recommendation is to prioritize assessment because pennies spent in prevention could save dollars spent on cure. So if you have purchased like IR retainers that are unused, then check if you can use it for perimeter assessment like we did for the SLTT environment. This is what we encourage our IR customers to do. And our team works closely with their IT and network teams to conduct the similar kind of analysis that we saw in this presentation, followed by like recommendation and a following process to fix the gaps that we discovered in our process. With that, I will give back to Rudolph. Any questions, any comments?
Yeah, thanks, Param. It's definitely got a few questions coming in. I think it's definitely interesting the way you kind of connected these dots, right? Because I think we think about elections in a very different way, but there's very relevant lessons to our own threat models here, for our respective organizations. So thanks a lot for sharing your insights there. Folks, keep the questions coming. We already have a few that have come in, and I'll go through them. If you have questions, if you don't mind using the Q&A feature or the chat feature, if that's more convenient. So Param, let's dive into some of the questions, right? So first question says, you started with an ASN or automated autonomous system notation. My organization does not actually own an ASN. How might I go about the first steps in your reconnaissance?
So we like We have conducted reconnaissance in multiple ways, and again, go back to the MITRE pre-attack. There are like around 10 or 15 different techniques that you can do for reconnaissance. As I mentioned, an attacker may simply go to your domain name, look at like the IP address. From that IP address, see like which ASN it belongs to, whether it is like AWS and other things. Then scraping your website may reveal other domain names which you're using, and then from those domain names, they can target your DNS to see like to get collect a list of like all the domains that your organization has. So there are multiple ways to map the environment, so as to speak. And we started with ASN because for the SLTT research, most of these organizations are big and they have their own ASN numbers. But even smaller companies, there are easy ways to build up the network map and then go about doing the same type of like attack surface analysis.
Yeah, no, and I thought you made a really good point during the one of your earlier slides where you talked about like looking at social profiles and job postings and things like that. How much information are you revealing that kind of exposes your attack surface? So that might be another source as well.
Yeah, like when we used to do like previously, I used to do red teaming, and LinkedIn is like a gold mine. Like you can find email addresses from multiple places, but finding the relationship between people, that makes your spear phishing campaign much more powerful, right? You know what type of email to send to CFO versus somebody working in HR, somebody working in some other department. So it really like you need to be very careful about what information is being leaked on LinkedIn.
Cool. So we kind of have a somewhat related question as the next one here. So you talk about an attack surface assessment. How often would you recommend we do this kind of assessment? Is it like a one-time thing and you're done, or any thoughts there?
Yeah, like people ask this question all the time. I think like it should be tied to your change management. Anytime you make a change, you do like an external scan. I think we can draw parallels to CI/CD pipeline. So if you have like a code and you are changing some code, so security should be part of your CI/CD pipeline in the code. In the same way, like in your network infrastructure, every time you are adding a port number or making any changes to your firewall, that change management should trigger, like the external scanning.
Yeah, and again, the point you made earlier about the unmanaged infrastructure, right? You may not even know that unmanaged infrastructure is coming on. So it sounds like it's something that has to be just constantly monitored. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Like as I said, like anytime you're making changes or, there should be a routine every quarter at least. And then like every time you're making a change, you can basically like scan for that change only, right? So given the coronavirus and given like the work from home situation, like so many network changes have been made. And if people are not tracking that properly, like their attack surface can get out of control, right?
Yeah, just I know from someone on your team found a Raspberry Pi that was plugged into, as a remote access solution during the COVID shelter-in-place thing. So it's just interesting how the attack surface may not be exactly what you thought it was even a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, people like with the IoT and other things, people add so many things to the network which are unauthorized that like any change, uh, as I said, like it's an asymmetrical warfare. We have to protect everything while the bad guy has to find one misconfigured device.
Cool. Um, so next question, how do you think about the attack surface in a world where so many of our employees are remote? What are your tips and suggestions there? So I guess it's a little bit related to the topic we were just talking about.
Yeah, many of the employees are remote, which makes incident response more difficult. I've seen like a lot of IR teams which are struggling with the remote workforce. Their strategies that they built in the last decade has to be changed in like a matter of weeks. And but like but on the other hand, there are like unified logons, for example, like Okta and other services, which makes like identity and zero trust more easy. So I think that companies need to really think about like what strategies and what playbooks they have in place to handle the remote workforce. And again, this is not a short term. I expect like remote workforce to remain even after COVID-19, and all blue teamers, including us, like we have to change our strategies to accommodate for this changing landscape.
Yeah, again, I think the point you made maybe on one of your first few slides are talking about the threat model. I think ultimately what this is teaching us maybe is that you've got to know what your crown jewels are and make sure you're protecting those, because I guess there's really no notion of, like you talked about zero trust, there is really no notion of a trusted perimeter anymore, is maybe one of the lessons from, maybe there never was, right? But at least with COVID now, we know that that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
great point.
So one more question. So one of the things you talked about, Param, was in one of your last slides was multi-factor authentication on all external-facing assets. Do you primarily mean websites over there, or can you clarify what you mean by external-facing assets?
I would say everything. If anything is connected, MFA is so easy to implement these days that like I think it should be implemented everywhere. There is no point if you have RDP. It shouldn't. I see the question like those asset. By those asset, I don't mean only website, because if you have RDP port open, or if you have like remote access open, those should be also MFA. As I mentioned, like many uh, we see it we see a lot of time in like dark web, people selling RDP access and VPN access, and those those can be simply mitigated by MFA. And again, penny spent on prevention will save dollars on the cure. So I would suggest that like implement MFA wherever you can.
Right, and like again, you brought up the point about VPNs being open and things like that. So it's interesting. I think you said that RDP is the number one vector for some of the ransomware gangs these days.
Yeah, like in many of the IR engagements that we do, the typical playbook that many of these ransomware actors they have is again like look at the hospitals that they are targeting. So they do the same thing. They look at the ASN information, they look at other things, they build up the network telemetry, and sometimes their network map are better than the hospitals themselves, more up to date. And they look at like what port numbers and what other things you have open to the internet. And if they find any RDP, especially if you're not using MFA and other protections, they can simply log on and move laterally. So typical playbook is that like uh, get onto, like if you haven't patched, like they can use Bluekeep to get on the to exploit the RDP service, and then straight away reach out to the domain controller, get the network admin access. Domain controller, if that is not patched, could be exploited by zero logon. And once they have the network admin access, they can deploy ransomware on all the machines and bring down your whole environment. So that's like a typical playbook that we have seen with some of these targeted ransomware gangs.
Cool. And again, keep the questions coming. Param, one more thing is around IoT devices that might be sitting, kind of on your perimeter that might be externally accessible, right? I mean, sometimes you may not have the ability to turn on 2FA on those. Do you have any kind of suggestions, tips based on your experience or the work you've done with customers?
So typically we tell them that like there's some IoT devices that you need to access from outside. So but most of them, so if you think about like the IoT devices you typically have at your home, your Alexa, your Google, and all those things, even if they're connected to the internet, they should only reach out and not allow anybody to reach in. But there are some IoT devices like webcams, smart webcams, and all those kind of things where people from internet, they also have to connect to those IoT devices. In those cases, obviously, again, goes back to zero trust, goes back to that like filter on the IP addresses which are allowed to access those, and then like have a you can have like a special login around that. So defense happen in layers, right? Don't think about that this is, if the system does not provide one way, you can protect on the network side. You can introduce like zero trust, as I mentioned before, or you can limit it down to certain IP addresses which are used for management. So there are different ways, and always think in layers, and don't depend only on the vendor to have protection, especially on this IoT devices. Each vendor has a different, uh, different security, and then but you can layer it with your own network security and other applications.
Yeah, and I think as you pointed out, sometimes the attackers know more about your infrastructure than maybe you do, because a lot of these systems are hard to find, right? So I think having that network level visibility that you're alluding to is critical to be, because if you don't even know if it exists, clearly you're not going to be able to protect it.
I don't want to make a sales pitch, but like that's the whole point of having NTA, so that you monitor all your network traffic, and you have complete visibility. And again, as I said, like you may have a CMDB database, but if you are not maintaining it, and with the coronavirus, your CMDB could be outdated, um, could be completely outdated. So if you can uh, build a dynamic CMDB using your network telemetry, that would be better.
Cool. So I think that's pretty much all of the questions we had for today. Param, I wanted to thank you for presenting today, and thank you everyone for attending. If you would like to share or view the recording, these are available, typically within a few hours on our YouTube channel and on the website. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for more of the insights from Param, the rest of his team. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Awake Security webinar. Visit us at awakesecurity.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and a great weekend.
Thanks, Rudolph.
Thank you.